So, Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the RSA, an organisation designed to create conditions for enlightened thinking and collaborative action to address some of society's most pressing challenges. That is a mission and a half, and is impressive in itself. Matthew is a former, apart from being the Chief Executive of the RSA, is a former political strategist and has operated at the highest levels. He was appointed by Tony Blair to head the number 10 policy unit in 2005. 2016, he was asked by Theresa May to chair the review on modern employment. And if Wikipedia is correct, you were also Assistant General Secretary of the Labour Party at some point, which is a real impressive CV. And I think for these purposes, for the purposes of today, what that means is we have someone in Matthew who has operated at the highest levels in terms of policy thinking and policy making in this country. That makes him the perfect person to lay the foundation stone of the Zebra Project, and I hope it's a very successful one for you. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I don't tend to refer to my time working for Tony on my CV anymore, partly because he said to me after the 2005 election, he said, Matthew, there's two key things I want you to do. One is to make sure that I remain popular, and the other is to make sure that New Labour controls the Labour Party. So, eventually these things will happen. But also, Matt, I'm so glad you're not anti-unicorn. I've got a 5-year-old daughter. If I went home and told her that I'd spent the day with a kind of bloke and he hated unicorn, it would have been the first time she was interested in my life, to be honest. But So, how can we create, lead, grow businesses that thrive in today's world? So that's what I'm going to explore over the next 20 minutes. Rather alarmingly, there's an alarm clock here, so it's presumably just going to go off after 20 minutes, so that'll make me stay on time. I'm going to take you on a kind of zigzagging, whistle-stop journey to explore that question and to provide some possible answers. On the way, I'm going to explore what motivates you and me, how organizations behave, the foundations of positive psychology, key insights from sociology and anthropology, and the way the world today poses new challenges and offers new possibilities to people leading organizations. Now, there may be bits in my speech that lose you. I tend to get two reactions to my speeches. One group of people most people love them, of course, but the few kind of maverick critics, one group who say everything I say is completely obvious, and the other group who say they don't understand what I'm talking about. So if you're in either of those camps, if you could just meet up over the coffee break, and then between you'll work out that the speech was brilliant. Are there any sociologists in the room? Yes, brilliant, fantastic. So you might be able to help people because I was trained as a sociologist, so that means that I'm kind of taught to be as opaque as I possibly can in everything that I say. You may have heard the old joke, what do you get when you cross a sociologist? I'm just speaking to you, actually. What do you get when you cross a sociologist and a member of the mafia? And the answer is someone who makes you an offer you can't understand. Right, okay, so let me talk about, let me start with you and me. Let me start with what motivates us. From the moment you wake up and choose what clothes to wear till the time you feel it's time for bed, you will make thousands of decisions. Now, nearly all of these decisions will be tacit. They're made unconsciously without any sense that you could have done differently. Most are implicit in that one decision is the inevitable consequence of another decision. If you want to go to work, you've got to find a way to get there. But in every case, it's just worth reflecting on the fact that potentially all of those decisions could have been different. You could have left the house naked. You could have handed your entire life savings to that beggar who always sits outside the station and makes you feel guilty. You could have run down the up escalator. And having eventually got to work, you could have told your workforce you decided to resign and retrain as an Olympic gymnast. Now, if we had to make every tacit and implicit choice that we make explicitly, life would be completely impossible. But if we examine the motivations behind our actions, we might find an underlying set of patterns of motivation. So a lot of what we do is essentially because we're told to. From obeying the law of the land, I assume you all do, to carrying an umbrella because that's what the weather forecast said, to observing the instructions that are generated by the people who are on every organization we come into contact with, to our own expectations of the people who work for us, that they will do what we tell them to. As employers, as employees, as citizens, most of what we do is simply a response, generally unthinking, to authority and expertise in the form of guidance and rules. But lots of our behavior, especially when it comes to our interactions with other people, isn't dictated by authority or governed by explicit rules. The way we treat our family over the breakfast table, the way we behave walking to work and jostling for space on the train, whether we do drop some coins in that beggar's plastic cup, the help and support we offer colleagues at work. In these areas, we tend to behave on the basis of social norms and values. What is expected of us, what we expect of ourselves, because of the kinds of people we are and the kinds of people we think we should be. Now, as we go on our daily round, it is for most of us quite rare to recognize or face a genuine dilemma. And when we do, it might be between that last voice, the voice that says, do the right thing, and a third type of motivation. Because many of our choices are based simply on our own preferences for our own life, from small decisions like the type of coffee we order, to big ones like the way we try to make our businesses better than the competition. We act in those cases on the basis of what we want or what we deem to be in our own interests. Indeed, large parts of the economic profession believe this motivation is all we need to understand the world and ensure that it progresses. And then finally, there's a motivation that's rather different from the rest, and it's less often acknowledged because it's not really a motivation at all. This is when we do things, or more often we don't do things, not because we have to, because we think we should, or because we want to, but simply because it feels like there is no alternative and it's not even worth trying to do things differently. So we carry on climbing onto that overcrowded train, even though it makes us tense and miserable, and we swear every morning we'll never do it again. We plod along at work, we slump on the sofa in the evening, we get angry at the political news, but we've got no intention of getting active. And we go to bed, once again, having failed to address the nagging worries we have about our family life. That's just me, actually. But so what I want to suggest to you is that much of what we do every day is the result of how we respond to and sometimes choose between these kind of four fundamental impulses. The drive of authority, the drive that comes from the expectations and values of the group, the drive that comes from our own sense of our own interests, and when we don't act, this kind of anti-drive, which we might term fatalism. So let's move from you and me and our day-to-day lives to organizations. And maybe like me, as the CEO of a medium-sized charity, you have to make decisions at work about how best to get things done. That's basically what we talk about most of the time. And very often in those conversations, if your organization's anything like mine, the underlying issue is how to motivate people to perform in different and better ways. So imagine an executive meeting to discuss such a challenge, because people aren't quite doing the things you want them to do. One person might argue that the problem is about incentives. The organization needs to reward people more directly for doing the right thing and maybe threaten them a bit more harshly with personal consequences for not coming up to the mark. It's all about incentives. The advocate of this position might acknowledge that such an approach could be divisive, could even risk incentivizing forms of gaming as people pursue the rewards on offer. But they will say that despite that, the added dynamism of competition, personal ambition, it outweighs those dangers. At that point, another manager might offer a different take on the problem. They might say the issue is actually lack of leadership. They might argue that the organization has too many competing priorities. It's got an unclear strategy. They argue for a process of organizational change based on a carefully defined plan, determined by the top team, perhaps calling on the services of an expert consultant. Now, when challenged, this manager might have to recognize that previous strategies like this have come and gone without any lasting effect, and maybe, if they've read the literature, that it's estimated that 70% of organizational change strategies completely fail. But ultimately, they might respond that it's their job, our job to lead. We're the top team. We're the only ones who fully understand the needs of the whole organization, the scale of the challenges it faces. And at this point, A third person might then make their pitch. This is a manager who prides himself on spending a lot of time on the office floor, chatting to people at all levels, getting involved in socializing with colleagues outside work. He feels the need to share some worrying signals. He's been picking up. Staff are demoralized. They feel the organization isn't living up to its stated values. They're resentful of disparities in pay and power. And rather than stronger rules or incentives, they want the organization to feel more supportive, more united. It's a great speech. Colleagues don't buy it. They say, no, well, a lot of the complaints we're hearing are from underperformers. Of course people find change difficult. In the end, we're here to be successful, to provide a service, not to look after people. Also, remember how the previous time we tried to engage staff, it turned in on itself and generated all sorts of impossible demands. So the conversation goes on through proposal, counter-proposal. Maybe in the end, a course of action is agreed, not so much because people actually buy into it, because they've just given up on what's become a dialogue of the deaf. No one notices that there's one executive member who's hardly said anything. She saves her view for her wife that evening. She says, I didn't have the heart to remind them how often we've done this before and how little difference it ever makes. So, you're bright people. You will no doubt have noticed the echoes in this fictional meeting with the forces that I described shaping the hypothetical day in your life. And they can be heard in many other conversations. I have spent much of my life in the world of public policy making, and there, again, you encounter the same fundamental set of motivational compass points. A recent assessment of policy making around the world, a kind of meta-study of thousands of policy initiatives, it concluded that there were three key elements of success. First of all, the policy strategy itself, the strategy and leadership element. Second, the degree of legitimacy which the public had in the eyes of the public, the fairness and values element. And thirdly, the realism of the implementation plan, much of which was about whether the incentives for individuals were lined up in the appropriate way. So when these elements come together, the hierarchical element, the group element, the individual element, success is much more likely. But sadly, such successes are more the exception than the rule. Now, you shouldn't be listening to my advice if I don't take it myself. So a brief detour into the employment review, which I undertook last year. If you decode that employment review, you will find that I applied this set of ideas to the review, even though in the end I wasn't actually implementing anything. And we won't know for another couple of weeks what the government's going to do with it. But if you read the review, what you'll find is, firstly, what I'm trying to do is to improve the framework of rules, to make those rules clearer, to make those rules more rational, to make those rules more aligned. But secondly, you'll find that throughout the report, generally speaking, I'm trying not to stop people doing things they want to do. So I didn't close down forms of flexible employment because most people who work flexibly want to work flexibly, and because it can be an innovative way of developing businesses. And thirdly, values, values, values. I put at the heart of that report the idea of good work, suggesting that if we wanted to improve work, it involved people buying into the idea that all work can be good work, overcoming the widespread assumption that there will just always be lots and lots of shit jobs, excuse my French, or a kind of master and servant view of the world, and saying there's no reason why all work can't be fair, can't be decent, can't give people scope for development and fulfillment. So in my review, I try to strengthen that kind of hierarchical, rule-based way of thinking. I try to go with the flow of what people want to do and innovation, and I try to underpin everything by a strong sense of shared values. Now, maybe you want some confirmation of this thesis. You might be sitting there thinking, well, this is all very well, but he's just made it up as he's gone along. So let me give you a couple of bits of confirmation. The first is derived from psychology. This is the only stuff, actually, that is kind of, it's worth learning this stuff, even if you think everything else is rubbish. You're actually going to learn something over the next 2 or 3 minutes. I'm just saying that to you because you're in that kind of post-lunch period when you might be thinking of drifting off. Anyway, first I want to talk about psychology. There's a theory, social determination theory. And social determination theory is the basis for much positive psychology. It was developed in the 1970s. Its authors identified 3 basic psychological needs in humans. Number 1, competence, to seek to control the outcome and experience mastery. Secondly, relatedness, which they defined as the universal want to interact, to be connected to, and experience caring for others. 3, autonomy, the universal urge to be the causal agent in one's own life. So here we have At the base of much psychology, slightly different formulation, but the same three active drives. Competence, that can be seen as related to the top-down hierarchical authority drive, relatedness as the group belonging, norms and values drive, and autonomy as the individualistic, what's in it for me drive. Now, this is a powerful and influential theory. It's, for example, the basis of the work of Dan Pink that many of you will have read or seen his lectures. Now, I think, because I am a sociologist rather than a psychologist, that framework has got two problems. The first is it's too positive. I mean, it's positive psychology. So its first problem, it's too positive. It doesn't recognize the power and ubiquity of fatalism, and it doesn't recognize that those different drives are actually in tension, something I'm going to come to in a minute. And the other problem with that theory is it's too psychological. It's too much about individuals. It's not enough about cultures and organizations. So let me introduce you to a second theory. Are you still with me, by the way? It's not too dense, this, is it? No, it's still interesting? You okay? Fine. All right. Just checking in. Good. All right. Not that I was going to stop anyway, but the second framework derives from the work of an anthropologist, probably Britain's most esteemed anthropologist, Mary Douglas. She looked at cultures, everything from a kind of tribe in a rainforest to modern organizations, or even families. And she said that every grouping that she came across could be plotted along two lines. The first line was what she called grid, and that was the degree and the rigidity of hierarchy in that group. The second was what she called group, and that is the level and intensity of shared identity and belonging. So having this kind of axes, it didn't take long for people to come along and say, well, hang on, we could reformulate this as a 2x2 matrix. So just think of this 2x2 matrix, grid and group. In one corner is high grid, high group. So lots of stratification, strong sense of belonging. Think of the Catholic Church or the senior ranks of the civil service. And they called this kind of culture, these anthropologists, sociologists, they called it hierarchical. Then the opposite corner, diagonally opposite corner, low grid, low group. So not much stratification, not a strong sense of belonging. Think of a marketplace. And they called this culture individualistic. Then move down from hierarchy to high group, low grid. So not much stratification, but strong sense of belonging. Think of a commune. Think of a spontaneous social movement. And they called this culture egalitarian. And then finally move up from individualism to high grid, low group, lots of stratification, not much sense of belonging. Think of a prison. Or Eastern Europe before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And they labeled this culture fatalistic. Now, among the things I like about that approach, that anthropologist's approach, is that they recognize ubiquity of fatalism. We are, after all, the only species aware of the fact that we're going to die. But also, they see these drives not as individual predispositions, but as cultural contexts. We don't walk around. You will have predispositions, but the way you respond will be determined by the culture in which you find yourself. When you're out shopping, you're individualistic. If you run an organization, you will have a strong tendency to hierarchism. The futurist and designer Charlie Leadbeater, a few years ago, he did a survey of the most innovative organizations in the world at that time. He looked at Pixar, the animators. He looked at FC Barcelona. He looked at a Cambridge molecular biology lab that won Nobel Prizes. He looked at an amazing Indian social enterprise that brought virtually free education to thousands of villages. He looked at all of them, and then he found a phrase. He had a phrase to describe all of them. He said, they are creative communities with a cause. Creative communities with a cause. So a particular type of leadership cause, a sense of belonging and shared purpose, a shared commitment to excellence community, but also organizations that gave full vent for people's creativity, allowed them to take risks, valued innovation. But now that would be simple. I could stop there then and we'd all be happy and it'd all be fine. But the second insight is that this is incredibly hard to do. And it's hard to do for two reasons. First, because each of those drives, the hierarchical drive, the kind of solidaristic drive, the individualistic drive, is in part driven by its antagonism to the other drives. Each of those drives really wants to be the only drive. There are people in every organization saying, well, if only we just gave people freedom, or if only we shared values, or if only we had stronger leadership, everything would be fine. And when any of those values expresses themselves, they get a counter-reaction from the other ones. Right? That's why the world is so messy. I want to give you a completely trivial but quite illustrative example of this. Years ago, I'm rather obsessed by the tube in this speech, I realised, but I was queuing up to get on to the tube at Stockwell, I don't even know, Vauxhall Station. I don't even know Vauxhall Station, but there was inevitably problems on the tube. So we were queuing up to get into the ticket hall, and it was moving very slowly. And there was a kind of barrier halfway along halfway through the corridor, along the middle of the corridor. Now, we were queuing up. Now, this queue was a queue which was a combination, its culture, of fatalism and hierarchy. We were queuing because we were told to queue, and we were queuing because everything just goes bloody wrong and I'm going to be late for work again, right? Then something happened. Some people in the queue, maybe because they legitimately had, absolute emergencies, or maybe just because they were selfish bastards, realized that you could duck under the barrier and you could walk up the exit and get to the front of the queue and to the ticket barrier. So a few people did this. What happened was there was a murmuring in the queue and something changed. We were no longer just people who queued because we were told to. We were queuing because we were the kinds of people who believed in fairness. You could tell. We became a solidaristic queue. We were antagonized by this pathological display of individualism, and values started coming to the fore. So what you'll find in all organizations is if the hierarchy overreaches, there's a counter-reaction within the culture. People go down the pub and moan about the fact that there's overreach. If there's too much individualism, there's a counter-reaction. So these things are always fighting each other. That's one reason why it's difficult. The second reason it's difficult is even when you get a benign balance, even when you get these things working together, changes in the environment undermine what you're trying to do. So for example, in finance, when things are going well, individualism with its cavalier attitude to risk tends to become predominant. Recognize that? When an external threat looms, we all tend to seek authority, which is why dictators are fond of the spectre of external enemies. And when change is in the air, and people feel threatened, they often group together defensively. So even when you hold things together, environmental changes and shifts undermine things. A few years ago, in the era of the mainframe computer, technology was the friend of hierarchy. Now, arguably, it's much more powerful as a tool of individual expression, collective mobilization. In politics, social media has been a powerful tool for tearing down hierarchies, not nearly so good at developing sustainable solutions. So, the question I want to leave you with, and on which I can give some pointers, but in which I'm really hoping you will offer your views, is how does the nature of business today and tomorrow facilitate or act as a barrier to creating what Charlie Leadbeater described as creative communities with a cause? Those places that get that right balance of authority, shared values, individual incentives. What's changing in the way in which those drives work? So let's start with the authority drive. Overall, and I think unquestionably, the modern world is a big challenge to traditional authority. Hierarchy is threatened, is challenged by the fast-changing and complex nature of the world. It becomes ever harder for bureaucracies to thrive because bureaucracies basically slow things down and act as barriers in information flow. So the traditional hierarchical bureaucratic organization is increasingly incapable of coping with the modern world. The unquestionable decline of deference and trust in modern society means it's less likely that leaders can rely on willing obedience. On the whole, organizations have more stakeholders, more tensions between those stakeholders, higher expectations of responsibility, accountability, transparency. It is ever harder to balance the short term and the long term. We now have organizations of 3 generations in the workplace, and often with leaders who find it hard to relate to younger people or to understand their tech-infused world. Having said this, there are things which also strengthen authority. For example, data, tech-based processes that enable leaders to have a better grip on what's happening in and around their organization. But more fundamentally, as Charlie Leadbeater's work suggests, the demand that is growing in all organizations for a stronger sense of purpose is both a challenge to traditional forms of leadership and an opportunity for new forms of leadership. So what about that second drive? What about values and belonging, relatedness? Well, one change, of course, has been the greater diversity of the workplace, the different backgrounds, values, ages of workers. Gone are the days when a professional workplace was largely made up of white men who would go down the pub together on a Friday afternoon and discuss their golf handicap. Mind you, looking out at the room, maybe anyway. Having said this diverse workforce is more likely to be in contact with each other through a variety of social media channels that have richer connections. And while today's teams may have less in common as individuals, they will tend to share a strong interest in the values and the purpose of the organization they work for, and they'll be more willing to tell the world if they think those values are wrong. Furthermore, they don't just care about the purpose of the organization in terms of the world, they also care a lot about fairness within the organization, as you can see, for example, in the call for greater action on gender pay disparities and the ever-growing backlash against directors' pay. And then what about individualism? In the end, the strongest drive of the modern world. On the one hand, younger people seem less obsessed with money and formal status, so the old tools of individual incentives and competition don't work quite so well. They're more interested in self-expression, in fulfillment, in quality of working life. They tend to see their job as a chapter in their long, varied life, not as a stepping stone to a linear organizational career. On the other hand, arguably, I can say there's not many young people here to contradict me. On the other hand, their sense of themselves can seem more fragile, less resilient than older generations. The boundaries between work and non-work and what people want from work and non-work domains have become fuzzier, something that has positive and problematic implications. As someone put it to me the other day, young talent is today more precious in both senses of the word. So let me use the two words that are always the most popular in every speech I give to conclude. Overall, my view is that the pace and scale of change in the modern world, and the various factors that I've described, particularly the challenges facing authority, means that building and sustaining organizations that are, in Charlie's phrase, creative communities with a cause, is probably getting harder. But I think there's also an upside. And running through all of what I've said is the idea of purpose. Purpose from the top, purpose in the group, purpose for individuals in their lives. I think modern organizations and modern workers are more capable of what sociologists would call reflexivity. That is to say, they're more able to understand that good organizations need the right combination of strategic, cause-based authority, of shared values, but values shared not on looking inwards, but looking outwards to achieve difference in the world, and enlightened individual aspiration. I think there is greater scope, and the best organizations demonstrate that, to be involved in a collective process of learning, of adaptation, and of growth. And maybe it's just because I'm getting old and I need to comfort myself, but I sense that there may be a new meme to join recent fashions like mindfulness or gender questioning or veganism, and that meme is wisdom. A capacity in the midst of change and uncertainties to speak to deeper realities and needs. That ultimately the fundamental things that drive and satisfy people haven't changed, and that the best organizations are those that speak to who we are as human beings, and thus enable and encourage us to bring our whole selves to work. Thank you.